Yeah.
Great. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, great.
Okay.
All right, we're live.
Okay, finally.
All right. Thank you, everyone who's joined us. And sorry we're starting a little bit late. We had a little technical difficulties, but we want to offer a warm welcome to Professor August Nimtz and to everyone joining us online. I'm Chris Caruso. I'm the Education Director at the People's Forum. We are a movement incubator for working class and marginalized communities and an accessible educational and cultural space in Hell's Kitchen in New York City. Like many places, our space is now closed due to the coronavirus, and we're moving as much of our programming online as possible. And we invite you to check out our website and social media at peoplesforum.org to find other free online educational events like this one. A brief introduction. August H. Nimtz is Professor of Political Science and African American and African Studies and Distinguished Teaching Professor at the University of Minnesota. He's the author of Marx and Engels, Their Contribution to the Democratic Breakthrough, Marx, Tocqueville, and Race in America, and a number of related articles in edited volumes and journals, as well as The Ballot, The Streets, or Both, From Marx and Engels to Lenin and the October Revolution, which was recently published by Haymarket Books. And we want to thank Professor Nimtz for joining us tonight, as well as for the labor that went into this truly remarkable and very timely volume. So our format tonight is that we've asked Professor Nimtz to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then I may pose a question or two, and then we'll take questions from folks online. You could use the Q&A function, so not chat, but Q&A function to submit questions if you're joining us on the Zoom call, and use YouTube chat if you're joining us on YouTube. So without further ado, Professor Nimtz.
Thanks, Chris. I want to thank you and the Lenin and the team at People's Forum for inviting me to be here. Sorry, I'm a bit of a Luddite when it comes to high technology, and sorry for the delay. Yes, as you know, I was supposed to be in New York at this moment, but for the obvious reasons, I'm not able to be there. So I really want to thank you all for rescheduling this, because this allows me to share it with a lot of people, including my students here at the University of Minnesota. The book itself was indeed a labor of love, but the only political justification, in my opinion, for the book, though, is it really doesn't help us, doesn't help humanity address the kinds of crises we are living through right now. And without it serving that purpose, I'm not sure it has much of a political justification. The world we're living in right now reveals that unless there's human solidarity across borders, humanity will not be able to deal with such crises. It's no accident, in my opinion, that the exemplary country at this moment is what the Cubans are doing. The Cubans are providing international solidarity. They're sending people to other countries. They're working with the Chinese on medicines to help to deal with the problem. The other day, when they invited and welcomed citizens who were on board a cruise liner, a British cruise liner, some of whom had the virus, and welcomed them into Cuba, whereas other countries refused to allow the cruise liner to dock. To me, it's exemplary, and it's no accident, in my opinion. It's because the Cubans made a revolution. They made a revolution, and it's from that perspective that I wrote the book. How do we duplicate? Can we duplicate what the Cubans did? If not by the letter, at least the spirit of what the Cubans did in actually making a socialist revolution. As you may have noticed, I wrote the book at the time of the Arab Spring, and thinking about the masses in the streets, not only there, but elsewhere. And there was a debate oftentimes in locations about the streets versus the ballot box. And there were those who argued that the ballot box was irrelevant, and those who argued that it's only in the streets. And it was with that background that I was writing the book. And what the book argues is that it's not either or. If you look at the Bolshevik example, and I knew from earlier readings deep in my memory banks was the Bolshevik example about how indeed the electoral process is not necessarily compromising. You don't end up being a reformist using the electoral process. And that was the experience of the Bolsheviks. And it was with that reality, that lesson, that I wanted to flesh that out in detail and provide for the first time, as far as I know, the details of what the Bolsheviks actually did. There was a small pamphlet, a 23-page pamphlet that's still in print by Pathfinder Press on Lenin as campaign manager. That was the only thing I knew about. But it was on the basis of that pamphlet that I began to carry out the research. I think the book makes only really two original claims, two original discoveries. The book itself really is simply an elaboration, an excavation, you might call it, of what's in the 45-volume Lenin collected works. It's all there. All I've done is to go through a deep excavation and to flesh out all of that information. So there's nothing new, nothing original on my part in that regard. I think what is original is first, I think I'm able to show, at least to connect the dots between the ideas of Marx and Engels, specifically with the electoral and parliamentary politics, to what Lenin was able to accomplish. And I argue, if you go back to the very beginning of the Marx-Engels project, when they had to grapple with electoral and parliamentary politics, especially, particularly their 11-page document called The Address of the Central Authority of the Communist League on March of 1850. And there they distilled the lessons of the 1.5 years prior in the German Revolution and the lessons of that experience. And they distilled those lessons, which in many ways was a self-criticism in that document for not having kept the Communist League intact and having suspended it into the broader democratic movement. And so on every page of the 11-page document, the question of independent working class political action, that's stressed on every page in that document. And that document also talks about how the Workers' Party should comport itself in the electoral process and look to elections not as an end in themselves, but elections as a means to an end. And the two most important uses that can be made of elections is that it allows the Workers' Party to get out its program, its ideas, to educate through the electoral through campaigning for its candidates, and that it allows them also to count their forces. They don't flesh that out in detail, but the fact that count their forces is right nearby the phrase count their forces is the need for the workers' movement to arm itself. They were expecting an upsurge, which didn't happen in the German Revolution, but by counting their forces, they were able to determine the extent to which armed struggle would likely be successful. They instructed the Workers' Party to run candidates, whatever candidates, even if the candidates had no chance of winning, and they should not be deterred by the argument that by running their candidates, they were dividing the vote and that you would allow the lesser of two evils to actually be elected. So very early in the workers' movement, we had to deal with this problem, the lesser evil problem. All right, so that's the 11-page document. What I do and what I argue is that that document served as the playbook for Lenin and understand certainly what he did in 1917, but leading up to 1917, that is the 4 Dumas, the elections that the Bolsheviks participated in. Lenin indeed as campaign manager. Lenin was was a tireless campaign manager, writing leaflets, counting votes, analyzing votes that the Bolsheviks were able to garner in the elections to those four Dumas. So by the time 1917 happens, the Bolsheviks have had a tremendous amount of experience in the electoral arena, which we can get into some of the detail. Okay, so that's the first original contribution I think the book makes. That is what I call connecting the dots between the historical program of Marx and Engels, with particular regard to the electoral parliamentary arena, to what the Bolsheviks were actually able to accomplish. I think that's original. I know of no one who's actually made that explicit connection. The second contribution is when I was writing the conclusions, I began to realize that perhaps I needed to come up with a term to describe what Lenin's perspective, drawing on the ideas of Marx and Engels, was about with regard to voting. And so drawing on a term that Marx and Engels used called parliamentary cretinism. Parliamentary cretinism is the notion that what happens in the parliamentary arena is the end all and the be all of politics. And regardless of what's happening outside in the streets, a parliamentary cretinist is exactly that person who's oblivious or thinks what's going on inside the parliament is the end all and be all of politics. They didn't live long enough to see mass elections. And so I think the term I came up to what I call voting fetishism. Yes, it plays a little bit on the notion of commodity fetishism, but voting fetishism is, I think, an original term on my part. And what I mean by voting fetishism is the mistaken assumption that when you vote, you think you're exercising political power. To think that when you're voting, you're exercising political power. That's what I call voting fetishism. When you vote, you're registering, it's a democratic, an important democratic right to register a preference for either a candidate or a particular policy. That's what you're actually doing when you're voting. You're registering a preference either for a candidate or a particular policy. To exercise power, well, to back up a little bit, when you think about when you're voting, it takes maybe about 30, 40 seconds or so to actually vote. And you do it as an individual, you're doing it alone. Nothing could be more further from the reality of power than something you're doing alone that takes a few seconds to do. No, that has nothing to do with power. Power has to be taken. Power has to be taken. You have to go to the streets and the most important things in politics throughout history, if you think about it, is what takes place on the picket line, on the barricades, or the battlefield. That's where real power is exercised. And the confused voting with that is what I call voting fetishism. And it can be dangerous. It can be dangerous to confuse the two. So I think in the term itself, I think is implicit in what Marx and Engels and what Lenin were advocating. That is, they never saw voting as an end in itself, but as a means to an end. And so I think those are what I consider to be the two original contributions of the book to make the link between the historical program of Marx and Engels with regard specifically to elections and parliament in the parliamentary arena and what the Bolsheviks were able to accomplish. And I think for those who think it's necessary, as the world we live in, I think makes also clear that we cannot reform capitalism. We have to get rid of it. We have to it's dangerous. The longer it's around, as we see right now in the world we live in, the longer it's around, the more dangerous it is for humanity. The best that capitalism has to offer humanity is behind us. That's behind us. And the longer it stays in the world, as long as it's present, we see what we're seeing at this particular moment. So for anyone who's interested And how do we maybe emulate or try to do what the Bolsheviks accomplished, especially in a society like ours, where the electoral arena, parliamentary politics has been around for eons. That's the context. That's the aim, the not so hidden aim of what I'm trying to do with this book. So I'll maybe let that serve by way of introduction. I can get into some of the details about what the Bolsheviks did in the electoral parliamentary arena, the time-worn problem of a lesser of two evil votings, what the Bolsheviks had to deal with. Maybe I should say a few words about it, since it's very much on our minds today.
That would be
Yeah,
great.
the Bolsheviks had to deal with this in the elections to the first Duma, but especially to the second Duma. They had to deal with this problem of the lesser two evils, and the evil in that particular moment is what might be called an incipient fascist movement known as the Black Hundreds. The Black Hundreds were this retrograde reactionary movement that brought together elements in the church, the landlord class, the most reactionary elements, in which they mobilized brigands, militias, armed militias in the streets, carried out pogroms against Jewish people in the empire, and it was seen as the great evil of that moment. And liberals within the political arena oftentimes argued that for the workers' movement to have its own candidates in elections would provide an opening for the Black Hundreds, and everything had to be subordinated to making sure that the Black Hundreds would not get, and the parties that represented them would not get elected. And so Lenin had to deal with this, and he dealt with it in many ways. Not the least, he poured over voting data, returns from elections, to actually count and look at whether or not the presence or the absence of the workers' movement candidates in elections, did it actually contribute at all to the election of Black Hundred candidates, and made a convincing argument it did not. And most importantly, unless the working class ran its own campaigns, it wouldn't be able to explain. See this as an opportunity to explain to the working class the necessity for its program. And most importantly, what Lenin understood, the Black Hundreds would not be defeated in the electoral arena. You will only defeat the Black Hundreds in the streets. In the final analysis, that's where the Black Hundreds would be defeated, in the streets. So that's one of the important lessons. The importance of campaign literature. Lenin was a stickler for using the campaign to educate, and that involved writing campaign literature that distinguished between liberals, between reformists, and between the Bolsheviks. He loved drawing up that kind of campaign literature to help the working class to understand who the different parties were, what they represented, and so on. And again, as a part of the educational opportunities that elections provide. One of the big issues that they had to deal with is, once you got elected, what do you do? Once you get inside the Dumas and so on, and the necessary discipline in order to act as a faction inside the electoral arena, but to use the parliamentary arena, to use the podium of the Duma to educate the masses. You use those few Bolsheviks who were able to get elected, use the podium as a way to make speeches. Then those speeches were printed, and they were distributed on a mass basis to help the masses to understand what the Bolsheviks were trying to do. Perhaps the most noble moment in what the Bolsheviks were able to do was in the fourth Duma. And that was the anti-war work. When the First World War, the Guns of August happened in 1914, it was only the Bolsheviks who actively used the Duma until they were arrested. They used the Duma to make speeches, to use the members of the Duma who had parliamentary immunity. Because they had parliamentary immunity, they could be used to actually do anti-war work outside of the Duma. And so that work on the part of the Bolshevik deputies, however brief it was, lasted maybe from August until about January of 1915. That's what because they were put on trial, they were jailed, they were arrested and put on trial. But the trial was used as a way to do political work. And so it's really what put the Bolsheviks on the map. I'm convinced until the trial, the Bolsheviks, certainly after the first and the second Dumas, but the Bolsheviks were not very well known, but their anti-war work is really what put the Bolsheviks on the map. So when, when the war began to take its toll on the Russian population, and anti-war sentiment began to build within the population, there was another factor, another precious gem, precious lesson that the Bolsheviks had learned in the 1905-1906 revolution. And that was to do political work inside of the military and inside the Navy, and to use the elections, especially to the Soviets. That's when Soviets sprang up spontaneously in 1905, and the soldiers and the sailors had their own Soviets. And so the Bolsheviks were actively doing political work and recruiting. They had 34 newspapers, 34 newspapers for the military, working inside the military. So that work was perhaps the most important, because in 1917, it's what the Bolsheviks were able to do based on an early experience. The work they were able to do inside the military goes a long way in explaining the success of the Bolsheviks in October, November of 1917, and why in the October, November revolution, maybe a handful, a dozen people were actually killed in the upright insurrection that took place in Petrograd. That was the result of all of the political work the Bolsheviks had done inside the military. In other words, if you win the military to the side, yeah, you can minimize the bloodshed by doing work inside the military. And that goes back to the 1905-1906 revolution. And the Soviets, of course, the Bolsheviks prioritized doing electoral work in the Soviets. So they were doing electoral work not only in the parliamentary arena, called the Dumas, in the local Dumas, but also within the military. Within the Soviets, because they argued correctly that the Soviets were much more democratic. They were much more democratic and representative institution than was the case with the parliamentary institutions. And that work was of enormous significance. There's been a new trove of documents that a Russian scholar has discovered in the last few years, looking at the letters of the soldiers in 1917. And she's able to trace through those letters and through the elections to the Soviets, how the Bolsheviks improved their vote and became the majority party inside the military, of crucial importance in understanding the success in 1917. So those are just some of the highlights that I can immediately think of about that decade or more long work between 1905, that's when the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks had the initial debates about whether or not do you participate in elections or not. That always became a big issue about, do you boycott elections or not? Under what circumstances do you boycott elections or not? And Lenin's overall perspective was, as long as the revolution was on an upsurge, as long as it was in accelerating, yeah, you didn't prioritize elections because you understood that the regime wanted to use elections to get the masses off the streets. So that created obviously always a big debate within the Bolsheviks. If you know that's what the regime wants, and so therefore do you participate in elections or not? And Lenin's argument was that as long as the revolution in the streets is still on the ascent, then participation of elections are to be to be avoided. That is, you can boycott, you can legitimately boycott. But once the movement is in the descent, once the energy is no longer there and so on, then you're obligated to participate in the electoral arena exactly to count forces and to educate. But it led to big splits within the Bolsheviks around this question of whether or not to boycott or to participate in elections. So I don't know, I'll maybe let that serve as by way of introduction.
That's wonderful. It's really such valuable work you've done excavating this history. I'm wondering if I could put a question or two to you, and then we'll open the questions up to the audience. And again, folks could type in questions in the Q&A section if you're on Zoom, and in the chat if you're on YouTube. I did want to ask you, Professor Nimtz, that you mentioned in your preface that talking about Lenin's electoral strategy has earned you some strange looks, and may, be even considered something of an oxymoron. And, in the US, if you talk to kind of young leftists in the US today, it's almost axiomatic that to be on the left means to be contemptuous of electoral politics. But as you point out, you can't find a single passage of Marx or Engels that advocate non-participation in the electoral arena. And Lenin devoted, a decade of his activism and writing to electoral work in one form or another. And of course, they had deep critiques and understood, electoral work as a means and not an end, as tactics and, not strategy. But how do you explain this disconnect of people's, people who consider themselves on the left? Why don't they understand this history?
Well, I speculate on that in the conclusions. In the Soviet Union, which the regime that had the franchise on Lenin's writings, I argue was not in the interest of the regime after Lenin's death to tell the real story about Lenin. And that especially became true in 1935 when Stalin imposed what became known as the Popular Front policy on parties affiliated with Moscow. And that is, they were to embrace the progressive or the national bourgeoisies, and then oftentimes they were discouraged in running their own candidates and having their own campaigns. Everything had to be subordinated to the rationale. The claim of this, the argument was that everything had to be done to stop fascism. And because there was never an honest discussion about why the fascists were able to come to power, and the bankrupt policies of Stalin that actually enabled the fascists to come to power in Germany, the Popular Front policy was a way to cover up, to avoid that discussion. So anyone trained in the tradition of Moscow and the pamphlets that came out of Moscow, the selected works, you would not have known this. I know of no, of all of the things that Moscow printed of Lenin that were short collections, things that comprise short collections, as they oftentimes did. I know of nothing that actually focused on his electoral parliamentary strategy. They published many short pieces or short collections of his works and so on. So the assumption was people were not expected to read the 45 volumes. Yeah, that's, yeah, you can get the shortcut to Lenin. And so I contend that many people like myself at one time who were educated by simply reading those short works that Moscow put together about Lenin would not have known about his electoral parliamentary strategy. So that's on one side of the picture. Then there's the other side of the picture, I think, social democracy. We have to be honest about the history of social democracy. And in many ways, as Lenin himself saw this is the anarchists. It goes back even before social democracy and the betrayals of the bourgeois parties in the electoral arena, and workers being felt betrayed by what liberal parties were doing. And in many ways, the origins of the anarchist movement comes out of that critique of what was going on in the electoral arena and how workers couldn't expect anything from the electoral arena. And what made Marx and Engels different, they were the first socialists who actually argued that the workers' movement needed to participate in the political process. It could not ignore the political process, the importance of the state. But then fast forward later to the end of the century, in the 19th century, as workers' parties were being elected, calling themselves social democratic parties, they began increasingly to compromise themselves. And Engels lived long enough to see this. And in the last decade or so of his life, did his best to try to reel this in, especially in Germany. He began to see the reformist course that the German party was taking, and did everything he could to try to halt that development. And so by 1914, we see the bankruptcy of social democracy with the votes that were taking place by the social democratic parties, with the German party leading the way to support to vote for war credits. And for anarchists, you see, this is the problem. This is exactly what happens when you participate in the electoral arena. So all of us at one time or another who have had ultra leftist tendencies have tended to buy into the assumption that the electoral arena. Look at Latin America, and this is what the part of the world I think I know best, and in Latin America, where communist parties and social democratic parties participated in the electoral arena and compromised themselves in one form or another. And so the alternative, as the Cubans thought, the alternative was to do what they did as a model, that is to carry out armed struggle and to regard the electoral arena as a graveyard for progressive movements, because unfortunately, because of what had happened in Moscow, with Moscow's control over the writings of Lenin, aspiring communists elsewhere in the world simply didn't know, and the Cubans were no exception. That is, radicalizing Cubans, of people of Fidel Castro's generation, simply didn't know about what Lenin had actually done in the electoral parliamentary arena. So that came with a lot of tragedy in many parts of Latin America. So the betrayals of both the Stalinists and also the Social Democrats, in my opinion, goes a long way in explaining why many of us at one time or another shunned, looked down upon any kind of participation in the electoral arena. And that's exactly what I'm trying to overcome in the book, and thus the title. It's not either or. Yeah, it's as long as you realize that elections are not an end in themselves, the parliamentary arena is not an end in itself, but it's a means to an end. As long as and what I try to do is to show exactly how Lenin was able to do that. So it's not some kind of a theoretical claim I'm making, but let's look at what the Bolsheviks actually did.
That's excellent. If I could ask you another question. You mentioned in the book, at a certain point, Plekhanov and some of the other Mensheviks are arguing that the party should be wooing the liberal cadets. And they're referring to the Communist Manifesto to say, look, this is what Marx would have wanted. This is what Marx would have done. And Lenin has a different position. He's trying in part to use the parliamentary arena to build this worker-peasant alliance and saying, let's ally with the peasant representative, even though there's some backwardness. But that this electoral arena is one of the ways in which he attempts to weld this worker-peasant alliance, which, as we know, is absolutely essential for the success of the revolution. But of course, the manifestos from 48, and as you point out, by 1850, there was already some other ideas happening in Marx and Engels thinking, but also, of course, the Paris Commune of 1871 is a profound event in impacts the thinking of Marx and Engels and also Lenin on the questions of the electoral arena, the role of the state, how to take and especially how to maintain power once it's taken. I'm wondering if you just have any reflections on the impact of the Paris Commune in particular on how Lenin approached these electoral questions.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Paris Commune, man. Most important. Its importance is registered by the fact that the only correction Marx and Engels ever made to the Communist Manifesto was the lessons they drew from the Paris Commune. And that lesson was the Commune had demonstrated that the working class cannot employ the bourgeois state to carry out socialist transformation. It had to create a new state of its own. Once again, the working class cannot employ the bourgeois state to serve its interests, to bring about a socialist transformation. A new kind of state would have to be created. And that's what the Commune was, a new state. And Marx always loved to say that, and the workers discovered that on their own. Nobody taught them that. They had to discover that on their own. This is what the Paris Commune. So you can imagine Lenin milked every lesson he could. Every lesson he could. When he went to Paris for the first time, he spent time in the libraries trying to draw all of the lessons of the Paris Commune. And so that's the other tragedy of social democracy, not heeding that lesson of the, yeah, you're right. You could argue that lesson is not in the main body of the Communist Manifesto. But boy, it's in the preface, it's in the introduction. It's in one of the later introductions that Marx and Engels make that claim. And it's a claim that unfortunately social democracy has not heeded. And the idea that you can make use of the bourgeois state to bring about socialist transformation has put the nail in the coffin of many a social democratic party. Many a social democratic party, exactly because they ignored what Marx and Engels had, the lesson they drew on the lessons of the Paris Commune. So in the Soviet, for Lenin, the Soviets were the closest thing or an example of what the Paris Commune was. That is, these representative institutions, not only on a geographical basis, but also in the workplace, having the working class being able to make decisions within this is what the communards figured out. They couldn't rely on the state. The state was an obstacle. It was an obstacle to meeting the demands, the pressing demands of the working class. And that's the reality today. Isn't this what we're looking at right now around us? We're looking at how the bourgeois state, the failure of the bourgeois state to meet the needs of the working class. And again, this is why I think the exception, the example of Cuba is so important. It's the only place I know. I may have missed some other. Some people talk about South Korea and the fact that the South Korean state was able to do a lot of testing so much more rapidly, which is true. But there's something special about the Cubans. The Cubans not only look out after their own citizens, but they look out at people in other countries. They come to the assistance. It's easy to look out after people who you think are your people. people who you think look like you, your tribe, your clan, and so on, boy. But when you come to the aid of others who don't look like you, don't speak your language, and so on, that's the nobility. That's the nobility of the Cuban Revolution. And so and the only way you have to have a state. You have to have government. The state and the government has to be in the hands of the working class. The lesson of the Cuban Revolution really came to home to me dramatically in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina, because my family was still in New Orleans when Katrina came, and boy, only out of luck, knowing people, and indeed solidarity. There was solidarity across racial lines that made it possible for my parents to get out of New Orleans safely. But what was lacking in New Orleans is that there was no government or state to organize that solidarity. That's what you had in Cuba. You had a government and a state to organize the solidarity. And it's important to know that solidarity was there, because it means, despite capitalism's efforts on a day-to-day basis to make us think as individuals, I got mine and you get yours, the dog eat dog values. That's what is drummed into us every day. And what Katrina revealed, what happened in the aftermath of Katrina, what it revealed is that there was enough solidarity amongst the working class to be able to look out for themselves, to try to survive this, but it lacked a state to do so. You were on your own. You had to figure out on your own how to get out of the floodwaters. In that very summer in Cuba, 2 hurricanes went through Cuba, even more powerful than Katrina, and no more than 10 people died that summer. In Cuba, evacuations take place. Millions of people are evacuated when a hurricane comes, and 80% of people evacuated go to the homes of other Cubans. They go to the homes of other Cubans. No, in New Orleans, you ended up in the Superdome. I had an uncle who was in the Superdome, and all of the horrors he had to face and so on. You were on your own. So yeah, the importance of the working class having its own state is a life and death matter. And that's what this present crisis reveals. If we don't have our own state, we will be in deep, deep problems. And this is what we're revealing. And so I want to make a case for the Cuban Revolution and the importance of the lessons of Marx and Engels, and the importance of why you want to make a revolution. The necessity of the Cubans cannot do what they did without having made a revolution. That's the claim I'm making.
Thank you. Absolutely. So we're going to turn to some of the questions from viewers. So we have a question from Kyle, who's asking, how did Lenin and the Bolsheviks' electoral tactics develop from 1905 through 1917? Did they maintain one policy throughout, or were there developments that their tactics had to react to?
Yes, they were obviously changes that took place. And one of the reasons for the changes had to do with the electoral system itself. In Russia, you had these indirect elections that were not direct. And the population was broken up into what are called estates. And each estate, such as the peasants, the urban dwellers, the bourgeoisie, had an electoral college, and each electoral college elected the candidate. So in other words, the structure of elections in Russia dictated the strategy that the Bolsheviks had to employ. So that prevailed in the 4 Dumas. When 1917 happened, however, there were important changes that took place because the electoral system opened up in a way it had not been with the four Dumas. So the Bolsheviks were able to do things differently in some ways in terms of their campaign work and how they related to the Soviets and also to the Duma elections, because the political system was much more open. There were direct elections, whereas in the Duma elections, in these indirect elections, they had to take account of that reality in dealing with the question, for example, the lesser of two evil question. So when that question came up, my reading of Lenin's strategy if there's one bedrock consideration that was a constant throughout, it was independent working class political action. That was the constant throughout the whole period. And the question was then, how do you carry out independent working class political action given the constraints of the electoral system? So at the most basic level, elections, especially the elections that took place in the workers movement, that is in the workplace, in the factories and so on, in those elections, under no circumstances, Lenin argued, should the Bolsheviks ever block with the liberals or the socialist revolutionary party, that is the peasant parties. The workers had to have their own candidates. You could block later at higher levels. It was possible to block, even perhaps to keep the Black Hundreds out. You might want to block with the liberals at the highest level. As you go from one stage to another to another. But independent, as long as the working class though was independent, had its own political party, that was the one constant in their campaign strategy, electoral strategy. Also, too, once people were elected and got inside the Dumas and so on, and here they would block on occasion with liberals, with the cadets if necessary, depending on the particular legislation, especially around the question when the pogroms began to happen in 1912. The importance of blocking with the cadets to bring pressure on the government to put an end to these pogroms. And so, but as long, and it goes really back to the 1850 address, I argue. Marx and Engels said in the address that the Workers' Party can have alliances with the petty bourgeoisie, but as long as that's all they were. Well, alliances are not unity. We march together with them, but we march separately. And it was from that perspective that Lenin tailored Bolshevik tactics.
Thank you. I'm going to combine two questions because they're related. So Andrew asks, why isn't the US ready for a political revolution, and how can individuals change that? And then we have a second question that says, what lessons do you think Marx, Engels, and Lenin's experience give us in the US for how to build an independent workers' electoral party?
Yes, we can't jump over objective reality. And the objective reality is that the conditions that make for revolutions have existed sporadically at times within the United States, and the capitalist mode of production for much of its history was able to deliver the goods to the working class. I quickly say, since I've been focusing on this issue recently, we should never ignore the revolution that did take place in the United States, and I'm referring to the Civil War and Reconstruction. There was a revolution that took place, and so under certain conditions, revolutions can take place within the United States. The problem, one of the problems we face is the question of what I call the graveyard of progressive social movements, and I'm referring to the Democratic Party. And if you look at the history of the Democratic Party, especially in the 1890s, when the populist movement went into the Democratic Party, it was the beginning of this process. This party of the slave owners, we should never forget, you got to explain how does the party of the slave owners become the progressive party. Yeah, so the populist movement was the first to go into it. And out of that experience, illusions began to build about the elections, the role of elections in bringing about fundamental change in the United States. For all of his, the good things about Eugene Debs, extremely courageous, Debs himself continued to see the electoral arena, even though he called himself a Bolshevik, he continued to see the electoral arena as a way to bring about change within the United States, fundamental change within the U.S. And then in the 1930s, with the labor movement, was also into the black hole of the Democratic Party, and it has been beholden and impotent ever since. We saw it later with the civil rights movement. We saw it later with the women's movement. Here in Minnesota, from where I live, it's the only state in which the working class had its own political party and actually won the governorship on four occasions. But by 1944, it was swallowed into the Democratic Party, and that's why in Minnesota it's called the Democratic Former Labor Party. And it offers all kinds of lessons, in my opinion, about this problem of answering this question about the United States and why it is that the United States is the only country where the working class doesn't have its own political party. But the lessons of all of that too is that it's one thing to have a working class party. If it doesn't fight, it has to be a fighting party. It's one thing to have a great program, but are you actually willing to organize to carry out a fight? But it's crises like this, what we're going through right now. I think it's the crises like this that expose the fact that if we don't have our own political party and so on, we will continue to suffer in the way that we are. Humanity is suffering at right. These are the teaching moments. So it's just important. This is why it's very important. Contrary to what the ruling class wants us to do, is to hunker down. To hunker down and get into our isolated spaces. It's the last thing we want to use every opportunity we can. What we're doing, you and I are doing, and the others are doing at this moment, to use this to come out of our private spaces, to be able to have these kinds of discussions and to draw the lessons, how to make sure that this doesn't happen again. What are the lessons? What are the lessons of this? And so it's going through these kinds of experiences, in my opinion, that will radicalize working people. And at the same time, there being a nucleus somewhere, a political nucleus prepared to do what the Cubans did. That's what the Cuban Revolution started with a handful of people that it was able to increase its size and to incorporate millions of other Cubans. But beginning with the program, having a perspective that if you, and taking very seriously what Lenin said in 1901, and that is, if you don't have a political party in place, when the shit hits the fan, it will be too late to try to form one in the process. If you don't have it in place, that was why the Bolsheviks could take the lead in 1917, because you have to think about it, there were other political parties. Why is it that the Bolsheviks were successful in 1917? It's exactly because the preparatory work, that insight on the part of Lenin in 1901, if you don't have a political party in place, when it hits the fan, it will be too late to try to form one in the midst of the upheavals and in the turmoil.
Thank you. Really valuable insights. So we have one more question from Kyle, who's thinking about examples of using the electoral arena to further revolutionary aims in the United States history, in particular the early Republican electoral campaigns, and how the abolitionists pushed them to a more anti-slavery position. And then after the war, more stern measures towards the former Confederacy between 1856 and 1868 is Kyle's question.
Yes, the lead up to the Civil War was of, there are many lessons that we can learn from that moment. And the abolitionist movement has a lot to teach us. And the emergence of the Republican Party in 1854, running a candidate in 1856, and forming a mass movement. There was a movement I didn't know about. It was great. They called themselves the Wide Awakes. We are wide awake. In other words, that was the woke movement of that period. That's what they called them. They campaigned for Lincoln. Some abolitionists abstained from the electoral process, not all, but some abstained from the electoral process. They didn't see the electoral process as a way to actually bring about to end slavery. But there were people who did. And so, yes, the campaign for Lincoln in 1860, the Marx, I call it the Marx Party, but I'm referring to those who were a part of the German Revolution, who were part of the Communist League in Germany. Many of them migrated, a number of them migrated to the United States, and they became active here and started doing political work here. And they campaigned when Lincoln, they attended the Republican Party convention in Chicago in 1860. They had a faction or a fraction inside of in order to put forward the strongest platform to end slavery. And then while Lincoln, they regarded Lincoln as the lesser of the two evils, but they went out and campaigned for him. They went to New York, Chicago, and elsewhere to campaign on Lincoln's behalf. And so, and once the war started, of course, they did the next most important thing. They joined the Union Army. All of the Marxist clubs disbanded because the task now was to be in the Union Army, and some of them became officials, major. One of them became a general, a major general in the Union Army. Joseph Weidemeyer, August Willich, also, I think he was a colonel in the Union Army. So they campaigned leading up to the war to get Lincoln elected, and once the war began, so I think their behavior was exemplary.
Thank you. So that is the end of our questions. I'm wondering if you had any concluding remarks you'd like to leave us with. Well,
as I've tried to tell my students, this is a historic moment in which we're living. This is unprecedented. It's never happened before. And rather than hunkering down, we want to distill the lessons. We want to learn from this. We want to learn from this to make sure it doesn't happen again. And so we want to have these kinds of conversations that you and I are having at this particular moment. We want to bring other people to be a part of those discussions and so on. And so that's our task at this particular moment. And if the book I've written contributes in any way to helping to draw those lessons and what is to be done, then I'm pleased, and I'm pleased very much that you and the People's Forum, it's a great place. I've had a chance to visit it once back in November. There was a Cuban 5 event, and that was my first visit there. And it's a great space in New York. And I wish the best for you all, and stay safe.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Nimtz. And we hope to have you back at the People's Forum when we're on the other side of this coronavirus epidemic. And in the meantime, folks should really check out the book if you don't already have it, The Ballot or the Streets, or both. I noticed actually that Haymarket has this book 30% off right now. So this is a particularly good time to pick it up if you have it. already. And just to thank you again, both for spending time with us and, really the major contribution you've made with this work here. And I think it's really invaluable for folks trying to think about exactly this question of what is to be done at this present conjuncture. So
I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Have a good night.
You too.